Good evening. I'd like to discuss The Peddler and Divinity, the article about George Whitefield, written by Frank Lambert. Unfortunately, following Jesus requires money. Lambert mixes Whitefield's terminology of consumerism with the evangelical message. Let's face it, Paul worked as a tent maker while journeying, but we also know that many gave to the cause along the way. And I see that similar as Whitefield. Everywhere Whitefield preached, he collected support for an orphanage he had founded in Georgia, though the orphanage left him deep in debt for most of his life. He is also known to have collected money for a slave school and desired to educate black folks. This was backed by some prominent South Carolina men, though it never came to pass. And let's face it, we have all invested time and money in projects that we thought would bring God glory and increase the kingdom. So I don't hold that against him. I believe that perhaps many of those who criticized him did so because of his overwhelming acceptance of every human as a chosen participant of God's salvation and grace, unlike so many others, the religious in those days. Whitefield proved to be the era's greatest media figure, according to Douglas Sweeney in the American Evangelical Story. He sold more publications than anyone else in America at the time, receiving advanced publicity and widespread coverage in the public press. And as Lambert notes, Whitefield did more than publicize his revivals. His writings presented the primary means of receiving his message. Lambert goes on to share the testimony of Samuel Morris, who claims that through the aid of Whitefield's printed sermons, which he shared verbally with his small congregation, his group survived and evolved into the first Presbyterian church in Virginia. And I'd just like to add that I did a research on the Cambuse Slang revival in Scotland a few courses back, and the Reverend William McCullough was in the habit of bringing the intelligence and the interesting events from print to his congregation in Scotland in regards to the Great Harvest, the Great Awakening, the spiritual harvest that was happening in America. And he did it to encourage and to add enthusiasm and excitement to his congregation so they would be looking forward to revival. And actually, George Whitefield did come and preach a revival there, field revival drawing 20 to 30,000. We may never know this side of eternity how many came to Christ as a result of written sermons from days past. We cannot put a price on salvation. As for others who might have gained prosperity through the Great Revival and through the pastors like Whitefield, we know that Franklin recognized Whitefield's rising star. And Thomas Kidd tells us in Benjamin Franklin, The Religious Life of a Founding Father, that in the early 1740s, more than half of the books that Franklin published were related to Whitefield, and his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, would increase its coverage of religion by 14% between 1735 and 1740. And actually, there were many people who were writing books and reading books all about religion and revival in those days. Every major community had a newspaper, and so many were taking advantage of Whitefield and the Great Awakening. And there were even publications that were printing about revivals, like Christian History, a revivalist newspaper in New England. But they were more of the old lights, and they were not interested in the enthusiasts, as George Whitefield was named. And they were looking for the revival of religion and an extraordinary move of God without all of the drama. It was a consumer society, and so many capitalists were taking advantage of the opportunity as well. So we must do well to remember that not every item that featured Whitefield was coming back to fill his pockets. The biblical worldview principle that I would like to touch on tonight is that the Bible teaches all men to recognize their human limitations. I believe George Whitefield did recognize his human limitations. I believe he preached in a way that he could give people a picture. He could paint them a picture. He could talk about things that they knew about, relate them to the gospel. And as I pondered over this article and the consumerism that still plagues our society today over finances and money and the gospel, I concluded that George Whitefield may have accumulated money, but God allowed it and God gave the increase. George Whitefield was limited, but God is not. It was and is God who moves on hearts and minds to buy and or give. Every sermon that I have read of Whitefield's, and I have read 3, points to Jesus. Though I'm sure that he, like all of us, failed at times and desired worldly riches, Whitefield was not wooing followers to himself. He did well to boast in God, and his labor for the Lord brought many to Christ. Thank you and have a good night.